The small town was quiet most days. People walked their dogs, waved to their neighbors, and mowed their lawns on weekends. It was the kind of place where everyone liked to believe nothing bad could ever happen. At the edge of that calm neighborhood lived a man who mostly kept to himself. No one really knew much about him. He wasn't rude, just private. He lived in a small brick house with a large oak tree in the yard and a tall fence that gave him a bit of peace. He had moved there about 2 years earlier. The neighbors didn't ask too many questions. He was polite when spoken to, always said good morning, and sometimes helped older folks carry groceries. His quiet, respectful way made people trust him quickly, even though they didn't know his story. Most days he could be seen walking his big black dog down the street just before sunset. The dog was a strong German shepherd with bright eyes and a calm but alert expression. Everyone loved seeing the two of them together. The dog would walk right beside him, no leash, just following gentle commands. You could tell they shared a bond that went beyond simple companionship. The man treated the dog like family. He spoke to him softly, often in short phrases that sounded like another language, almost like codes. The dog understood every word. When children rode by on their bikes, the dog would sit and wait until they passed. He never barked at anyone, never caused trouble. Neighbors would sometimes stop to watch the man train his dog in the open field nearby. He would whistle, give quick hand signs, and the dog would follow perfectly. The movements were sharp and precise, almost professional. People joked that the dog should be in the movies, but the man only smiled. No one knew that those commands weren't for show. They were the same techniques he had used years ago in places most people would never want to imagine. He had once lived a very different life. He had been part of something that required complete control, skill, and calm under pressure. But he didn't speak about it to anyone. His past was something he had left behind intentionally. In this quiet town, he found a kind of peace he didn't think he would ever have again. The routine was simple: morning runs with the dog, long walks in the evening, and evenings spent repairing old tools or reading books on the porch. He wasn't close friends with anyone in the neighborhood, but everyone respected him. They knew he had good manners, paid his bills on time, and never caused problems. The local kids sometimes came by to ask if they could pet the dog, and he always said yes as long as they were calm. He would kneel beside them, guiding their hands gently, teaching them how to let the dog sniff first. You could tell he understood patience deeply. Inside his house, everything was neat and organized. The furniture was simple but solid. There were no photos on the walls, just a few books and some old equipment tucked away in a locked cabinet. A framed certificate sat quietly on a shelf. No fancy medals, no pictures, just a line of text and a date. It was from a time when he had served his country. He didn't look at it often, but sometimes when the nights were long, his eyes would rest on it, remembering faces and voices from long ago. The dog, his loyal companion, was the one thing that kept him grounded. He had rescued the animal from a shelter 3 years earlier. The dog had scars too, not visible at first glance, but there if you looked close. Maybe that's why they connected so quickly. They both carried quiet histories. They both had been trained to survive. Every morning before sunrise, he would make coffee, pack a small breakfast for later, and take the dog to a quiet park. There they would train. Not the kind of training people do for fun. This was disciplined, deliberate. The dog would crawl low under benches, sprint between trees, stop at signals. The man would give orders calmly, rewarding him with gentle pats and praise. It was their ritual, and it gave both of them purpose. Afterward, he would sit on a park bench with the dog lying beside him. The first light of morning would shine across the open field, and he would close his eyes, breathing in the quiet. That peace was what he had worked hard to find. One of the few people who occasionally spoke with him was the mail carrier. She was kind and always said how well behaved the dog was. She once asked if he had ever trained dogs professionally. He only smiled and said, "You could say that." She laughed, not realizing how true it was. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low, the man and his dog would sit on the porch. He would throw a small ball across the yard, and the dog would sprint after it, ears back, moving with perfect precision. The dog never missed. When the ball was brought back, the man would look into the dog's eyes and say softly, "Good boy." Always on point. Those words carried more meaning than anyone around them would ever guess. Sometimes the man would hear police sirens in the distance. The sound would make him pause for a moment. It wasn't fear, more like instinct. He had been in too many situations where that sound meant something dangerous was coming, but then he would remind himself that this was different now. This was peace. The small community had its own rhythms. People gossiping, small-town meetings, kids playing basketball in the street. The man wasn't part of any of that, but he didn't mind. He liked watching life move around him without having to be in the middle of it. It gave him space to breathe. Once, a neighbor's car wouldn't start, and the man came over quietly with a small toolkit. Within minutes, he fixed the problem. The neighbor tried to pay him, but he shook his head. "Just helping out," he said simply. The neighbor later told others, "He's one of those people who doesn't talk much, but when he does, it's always calm." You can tell he's seen things. The only real family the man had was the dog. They were inseparable. When he went to the grocery store, the dog waited by the door until he returned. When it rained, the dog would sit near the window watching raindrops slide down the glass, waiting for the next walk. The two of them didn't need words. They understood each other through silence. One evening, as they were walking home, a group of teenagers shouted across the street asking if the dog was a police dog. The man smiled faintly and said, "No, just a loyal friend." They laughed, but one of them said, "That's one serious-looking friend." They were right. The dog had a sharp, intelligent gaze, one that never wandered. It was always focused, always alert. The man's daily life was ordinary to anyone watching, but to him it was sacred. He had built this rhythm out of years of chaos. Each quiet morning, each gentle routine was part of a healing process. He didn't need much, just peace and the steady presence of his companion. The local kids began calling the dog Shadow because he followed his owner everywhere. The name stuck. Even adults started referring to him by that name when they saw them on walks. Shadow became something of a local favorite. Everyone knew not to mess with him, not because he was dangerous, but because his loyalty was obvious. Sometimes, when the weather was nice, the man would take Shadow to a field outside of town. He would sit under a tree while the dog ran freely. There, away from noise, they both seemed at ease. The man would toss a stick, and Shadow would race after it, kicking up dust as he went. When the dog returned, panting and proud, the man would smile quietly, a rare warmth softening his face. He had seen too much of the world's darker side to take peace for granted. Every quiet moment, every slow sunset meant something to him. He often thought about how strange life was, how people could go from battlefields to small towns, from danger to calm. At night, when he lay in bed, the dog would rest at the foot of it. Sometimes in his sleep, the man's mind would wander back to memories he tried to forget. Loud sounds, confusion, moments where survival was the only thought. Then, in the middle of those dreams, he would feel the dog's weight against his leg. That simple, solid presence reminded him where he was now, safe, home. There was one particular morning that stood out. It was a calm, golden sunrise, the kind of morning that makes everything look clean and new. He stood outside with a cup of coffee, watching Shadow play with a stick. A young boy from next door waved and shouted, "Can I throw it?" The man nodded. The boy tossed the stick and Shadow sprinted off, tail wagging. For a few minutes, laughter filled the air. It was the sound of something pure, the kind of sound that reminded the man why he had chosen to leave everything else behind. Later that day, he cleaned his porch, trimmed the grass, and took Shadow for another walk. Everything about that day felt simple, peaceful. He had no idea that the calmness of that life, the rhythm he had built so carefully, would soon be tested in ways he never wanted to imagine again. That evening, after returning home, he filled Shadow's bowl with food and water. The dog ate quietly, tail wagging with every bite. The man sat nearby, lost in thought. He had learned long ago that happiness wasn't loud. It was quiet, like a soft heartbeat in a silent room. The night came slowly with the hum of distant crickets and a soft wind brushing through the trees. The man locked his doors, checked the windows, and sat down with a book. Shadow rested beside his chair, his breathing steady and calm. Outside, the town lights flickered on one by one, as if marking another peaceful night. Before going to bed, he walked to the back door, opened it, and let Shadow out for a minute. The dog sniffed the air, then looked back as if asking permission. The man nodded. When Shadow returned, the man patted his head gently and whispered, "Good night, partner." He turned off the lights, unaware that in a few days, everything he knew about peace and safety would change forever. For now, the world was still. The man and his dog slept soundly side by side, one resting from years of battles, the other simply being loyal as always. The moon hung quietly above the town, casting silver light across the rooftops. It was the kind of night that felt endless, the kind you never think will lead to anything else. The man's breathing slowed, the dog's tail twitched in his sleep, and the house remained perfectly still. For anyone passing by, it was just another ordinary home. But inside, two souls rested. One human, one canine, both bound by loyalty, trust, and a quiet strength that had carried them through far more than anyone around them could ever imagine. It started as an ordinary morning. The man woke up early, just like always, made a cup of black coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and the world felt peaceful. Shadow followed close behind, stretching his legs and wagging his tail. The man smiled and scratched behind the dog's ears. The two of them stood there for a while, just listening to the sounds of birds waking up. He didn't know that somewhere across town, a small misunderstanding was already beginning to unfold, one that would reach his doorstep by nightfall. That day felt like any other. He fixed a few things in the shed, ran errands, and stopped at the small grocery store on the corner. The clerk greeted him politely. People there knew him as the quiet guy with the well-trained dog. When he walked through town, Shadow stayed close, never pulling, never barking. Children always wanted to pet him. The man usually let them, smiling softly while the dog wagged his tail. By afternoon, the sky had turned golden. It was the hour he loved most. He grabbed Shadow's leash, not because he needed it, but out of habit, and they headed out for their evening walk. The same route as always, down the hill, past the park, and back up the quiet residential street. Neighbors waved. Some people were mowing their lawns, others sitting on porches. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you forget the world can be cruel sometimes. Shadow walked happily beside him, occasionally glancing up as if checking in. When they reached the corner near the empty lot, a small group of kids were playing basketball. The ball bounced into the street and rolled toward Shadow. The dog stopped, sniffed the ball, and nudged it back with his nose. The kids laughed, and the man smiled. "Your dog's so smart," one of them said. "He just listens," the man replied quietly. They continued their walk, the sunset painting long shadows across the road. As they turned toward home, a police cruiser drove slowly by. The officers inside glanced at him but didn't stop. He didn't think much of it. Police cars came and went often. He'd spent years around uniforms. It didn't bother him. But later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered on, another call came into the local police station. A woman reporting a large black dog and a suspicious man walking near homes. She didn't know him, and maybe his quiet, watchful way made her uneasy. Maybe the dog's size looked intimidating from far away. Whatever the reason, that call would change everything. The man had no idea. He was back home now, feeding Shadow and cleaning up the porch. The dog finished eating, then settled by the front steps, his ears perked toward the road. The man sat nearby, sipping water and letting the night settle around him. About 20 minutes later, headlights approached slowly. A police car rolled to a stop in front of his fence. Two officers stepped out. The man stood up, surprised but calm. Shadow lifted his head but didn't bark. One officer called out, "Sir, can we talk to you for a moment?" "Sure," the man said, walking toward the gate. "Something wrong?" "We got a call about a suspicious individual walking a large dog around here," the officer replied. The man frowned slightly. "I live here," he said quietly. "We take the same walk every evening." The younger officer looked uncertain, glancing between the man and the dog. Shadow stood beside his owner, tail low, alert but calm. "He's trained," the man added. "He doesn't bite or chase anyone." The older officer nodded, but there was still tension in the air, the kind that builds when people don't know each other and don't understand what they're seeing. The man tried to keep his tone even, gentle. "You're welcome to check my ID if you like," he said. The younger officer hesitated, then reached for his radio. The moment felt strange, stretched thin and awkward. The man could sense it. He had felt tension like this before, though never in his own front yard. He took a slow breath, keeping his movements steady. Shadow sensed it too. The dog's body went still, waiting. Inside the cruiser, a dispatch call crackled, repeating the address. A passing car slowed down, headlights washing across the yard. The sudden light made Shadow turn his head. It wasn't a big movement, just a reflex, but one of the officers stepped back slightly. "It's okay," the man said quickly. "He's just looking." Everything could have ended right there. Just a short misunderstanding cleared up with a few calm words. But the tension hung thick in the air. One officer spoke into his radio again. The other kept his eyes fixed on the dog. The man raised his hand slightly, showing he wasn't a threat. "You're fine," he said quietly. "He's fine." The officers didn't lower their stance, and the man could see the worry in their eyes. He knew that kind of fear. It was the same fear he had seen in young soldiers years ago, people trying to stay in control of a situation they didn't fully understand. Then came a sound, a loud bang from a car door slamming somewhere down the street. It startled everyone, including Shadow. The dog's ears shot up, and he took one quick step forward, not aggressive, just alert. "Shadow, stay," the man said immediately. The dog froze, obeying instantly. But in that tiny, fragile moment, something in the air broke. The younger officer shouted something unclear, and the man's heart sank. He saw fear, confusion, and noise blending together. He tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by radio chatter. Shadow stood perfectly still beside him, tail stiff, eyes on his owner. The man slowly reached down, signaling for the dog to sit, but one of the officers shouted, "Don't move." The man froze mid-motion. His calm eyes met the officer's nervous ones, and for a second, the world felt unreal, as if time had split into two paths, one where peace continued, and one where everything went wrong. He could feel his pulse, steady but heavy. Every instinct told him to keep his voice low, to ease the tension. "Officer," he said softly, "please relax. There's no danger here. He's trained." The older officer hesitated, lowering his voice into his radio. "Control, we're at the address. Subject cooperative. Large animal present." The man took a slow breath, trying to diffuse the moment. He had been in situations much worse than this. He knew how quickly things could spiral. "Look," he said, "I understand you're doing your job. I serve too, I get it. But this dog, he's all I've got, please." For a second, something softened in the older officer's face. But before anything else could be said, a second cruiser arrived, lights flashing across the quiet street. The flashing colors startled the dog again. "Shadow, sit," the man said firmly. The dog sat down immediately. The scene drew the attention of neighbors who peeked from windows, unsure what was happening. The man could feel eyes on him, could feel the misunderstanding growing like a storm cloud. He tried to speak again. "If you'd like, I can take him inside. We can talk there." The older officer nodded slightly. "Go ahead, sir, slowly." The man turned halfway toward his porch, giving Shadow a quiet hand signal to follow. The dog moved obediently, muscles relaxed, tail still. For a moment, it seemed like the tension was finally breaking. Then from behind, a loud voice shouted, "Watch the dog!" Shadow turned his head sharply, startled by the sudden shout. The man instinctively turned too, hands still visible. His voice rose slightly, calm but urgent. "He's okay. He's not..." But the words never got to finish. In the confusion, sound blurred with movement. The man's heart clenched as Shadow yelped and stumbled. It happened too fast for him to understand in that moment. A single flash, a noise, and then silence that felt endless. He dropped to his knees beside the dog, the world spinning. Shadow looked up at him, confused but trusting, the way he always did. The man pressed his hand gently against the dog's side, whispering soft words that only they would ever understand. The officers shouted commands, but their voices faded into background noise. The man wasn't angry, not yet. He was simply still. Completely still. The way soldiers go silent after a blast, not out of fear but out of something deeper. He didn't look up right away. His mind refused to register what had just happened. When he finally stood, his face was unreadable. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just looked at the officers, not with hate but with a calm that scared them more than any shouting could have. The older officer tried to say something, but the man raised a hand slightly, as if asking for quiet. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that." One of the neighbors ran out onto their porch shouting, "What's going on?" But the man didn't turn. He was focused only on the still shape lying near the porch steps. After a moment, he walked slowly to the dog, knelt down, and placed a hand on his head. The flashing lights painted his face in blue and red, but his expression never changed. He whispered something softly, words no one else could hear. The officers called for animal control, for backup, for whatever the procedure said to do. But none of that mattered anymore. The man didn't move until they approached. When they finally stepped closer, he stood up, silent, composed. "I'm fine," he said quietly. "You can go." "Sir, I said, "You can go." There was no anger in his tone, just a quiet authority that made both officers hesitate. They didn't know why, but something in the man's presence made them uneasy. It wasn't aggression, it was control. He watched them leave, watched the cars pull away one by one. When the street fell quiet again, he turned back toward his house. The porch light flickered, casting a soft glow over the yard. The night was silent now, except for the faint hum of insects in the grass. He walked inside slowly, his hands trembling slightly now that it was over. He sat in the chair by the window, staring out into the darkness. The leash still hung from the hook near the door. He reached out, touched it gently, and let out a long, quiet breath. He didn't sleep that night. The house felt too empty, too quiet. Every small sound reminded him of the dog's breathing, the soft padding of paws across the floor. He sat by the window until dawn, watching the first light of morning break across the rooftops. When the sun finally rose, he stood up, went outside, and looked at the empty yard. The air felt heavy, the world slower somehow. He knelt by the grass where the leash still lay, and for a long moment he didn't move. The calm was gone. What remained was silence, the kind that carries weight, the kind that changes a person forever. He looked toward the horizon, eyes steady, voice barely a whisper. "You trusted me," he said, "and I'll make it right." Then he stood, walked back inside, and closed the door behind him. The house returned to stillness, but something inside him had shifted. The quiet man who once just wanted peace was gone. What remained was someone who had seen too much to let injustice pass quietly. And somewhere in that silence, a promise began to form, one he intended to keep, no matter how long it took. The next few days passed like a fog. The man barely spoke to anyone. People in the neighborhood noticed he wasn't walking his dog anymore, but they didn't know why. The police cars had come and gone, and the street was quiet again, but the peace that once filled his small house had disappeared. Inside, the man sat alone most of the time. The leash still hung by the door, untouched. The food bowl was still there, half-filled, like he couldn't bring himself to move it. Sometimes in the stillness of night, he thought he heard soft footsteps or a tail brushing against the floor, sounds that weren't really there. He tried to focus on small things, cleaning, fixing the fence, reading. But every moment felt heavier than the one before. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow. Neighbors left flowers by the gate. Some said they were sorry, even though they didn't fully understand what had happened. He nodded politely but didn't invite anyone in. People thought he was just grieving. They didn't know the truth, that grief wasn't all he felt. He was also remembering. For the first time in years, old memories began to surface. Moments he had buried deep inside. He remembered his time in service, the long nights, the quiet missions, the way he had been trained to read people, to plan, to stay calm under pressure. He had always followed rules, always believed in doing things the right way. Now, those same instincts were waking up again, but for a different reason. He didn't want revenge, not the kind people see in movies. What he wanted was truth, understanding. He wanted to know why things had gone the way they did, why no one had listened, why fear had spoken louder than reason. The more he thought about it, the more he realized something deeper was wrong. The police had left that night without even saying much. No one followed up with him. No apology, no report, just silence. One morning he made a decision. He pulled out a small metal box from the back of his closet, the kind used to hold old photos or letters. Inside were items from his past, a folded patch, a watch, a few IDs from another life. At the very bottom there was a simple black notebook. He opened it and began to write. At first, he only wrote what happened, every detail of that night step by step, from the moment the officers arrived to the moment they left. Then he wrote about the days after, the quiet, the emptiness, the way the world kept moving as if nothing had happened. Writing helped him think clearly. It gave shape to the storm inside. After a while, he started making notes, things he had noticed. The license plate numbers on the cruisers. The time they arrived, the names he had overheard from their radios. He wasn't angry. He was precise, calm. When he was younger, that's how he used to operate, with focus, patience, and quiet observation. And now, without meaning to, he had returned to that way of thinking. The town carried on as if everything were normal. Kids played outside again. Lawns were mowed. The world didn't stop for one man's pain. But behind closed doors, he began to move differently. He spent his mornings jogging again, not for fitness, but to clear his head. He started watching the world more closely. He noticed things he hadn't paid attention to before: who drove by his house when the same cars appeared, which officers were on patrol. He didn't want trouble. He wanted to understand. At night, he'd sit by his small desk reading public information on his old laptop. Most of it was dry, full of policies and words meant to confuse. But he kept digging. He wasn't looking for rumors. He was looking for facts. Over time, patterns began to appear. Reports of small mistakes, misjudgments, and cases swept quietly aside. It wasn't just what happened to him. It had happened to others too. He never said a word about what he was doing. He didn't tell the neighbors, didn't post online, didn't complain. He just watched and learned. The same patience that once made him a good soldier now made him something else. A man with purpose again. Sometimes, when he grew tired, he'd sit on the porch at night, staring at the stars. He'd think about Shadow, the loyalty, the calm eyes, the way that dog trusted him without hesitation. He would whisper softly, "I'll take care of this." I promise he didn't mean it as vengeance. He meant it as duty. One afternoon, while cleaning his shed, he found an old storage box labeled Tools. Inside, buried beneath dusty equipment, was a camera. Small, sturdy, built for rough use. He tested it, replaced the batteries, and smiled faintly when the lens blinked to life. That evening, as the sun went down, he took a slow walk through town. He nodded to people he passed, the same calm expression on his face. No one suspected anything unusual, but he was paying attention, the way he once did in missions where observation meant survival. Every corner, every patrol route, every small detail went into his notebook later that night. By the end of the week, his notes had grown thick. He didn't have a plan yet, just a growing map of truth. Then something unexpected happened. A letter came in the mail, addressed to him. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a short printed statement from the local police department, saying the case regarding the animal incident was closed and that proper procedures had been followed. He read it twice, then placed it on the table. That was when the decision settled fully inside him. He couldn't let it end there. He didn't shout or break things. He didn't call anyone or post anything online. Instead, he went to the shelf, took down the old framed certificate from his service days, and set it on the table beside the letter. He looked at both pieces of paper, one representing honor, the other avoidance. Then he picked up a pen and wrote a single line across the top of a blank page in his notebook. If the truth isn't told, it gets buried. From that moment, his calm routine became something sharper. He started contacting a few old acquaintances, not close friends, but people who still worked quietly in areas where information flowed. Retired officers, journalists, even a former investigator who owed him a favor from years back. He didn't reveal everything. He just asked questions, small ones, the kind that didn't raise alarms. How would someone get a full incident report? Or where do public camera records go? Each time he learned a little more. The town's main street had several security cameras, and there were police body cams too, but those were harder to access. Still, he knew patience always revealed openings. He didn't rush. He spent nights reading laws and procedures, understanding exactly how things worked. The more he learned, the calmer he became. In the mornings, he would still greet his neighbors. Some had stopped to ask, "Are you doing okay?" He would nod and smile faintly. "I'm managing," he'd say. He wasn't lying. He really was managing it in his own way. One night, he sat outside under the dim porch light, flipping through his notebook. Every page was filled with observations, times, and connections. It was almost like the mission logs he used to write years ago, only this time the battlefield was different. He thought again about Shadow. The dog had always trusted him to make good decisions, and now, even without words, it felt like that trust still guided him. The next morning, he made a small trip to the city library. He sat quietly at a computer station, searching public archives. Then, in the far corner of a local news site, he found something. A short article mentioning the same officers who had come to his home. They had been involved in another call months earlier that also ended poorly, but the report had been withdrawn. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing yet, but it was a piece of a puzzle. He copied what he needed and left. For days after, he followed the same routine. Study, record, plan. The world outside had no idea what he was doing. To the neighbors, he was still just the quiet man who once had a good dog. But behind that calm face, a quiet storm was forming. Not of anger, but of purpose. He didn't want to destroy anyone. He wanted accountability. He wanted truth. He wanted peace, the real kind. The kind built on honesty, not silence. Sometimes he caught his reflection in the window and barely recognized himself. Not because he looked different, but because the calm man he used to be had become someone sharper, more awake. Still, he didn't act rashly. He kept his emotions under control, the way he had been trained to. He reminded himself that patience always wins over chaos. Weeks turned into months. Small details came together, tiny clues that, when combined, told a bigger story. Slowly, he began to see the full picture of how that night unfolded, and how the truth had been buried under layers of reports and excuses. He knew what he had to do next, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone, so he reached out to one more person, a friend of a friend who had once worked with local media. He didn't share his name or address at first, only the story, written simply in a letter. He attached a few copies of documents and ended with one quiet line: "The truth doesn't hurt those who are honest." He didn't sign it. Then he mailed it and waited. Days passed. Then one evening a message appeared in his inbox from an anonymous sender. "I believe you. Can we talk?" He read it twice, then looked toward the empty space where Shadow used to sleep. He could almost imagine the dog's calm gaze, as if saying, "You're doing the right thing." He replied with a simple line, "Yes, but on my terms." That night he didn't sleep much. The sound of rain tapping against the windows felt strangely comforting. It reminded him of nights long ago, before the world had become complicated again. He didn't know what would come next, whether the truth would finally surface, or if the silence would return even stronger. But he was ready, because this time he wasn't running from his past. He was using it. When dawn broke, he stepped outside and stood where Shadow used to sit. The morning air was cool, and for a brief moment the world felt peaceful again. He took a deep breath and whispered, "We're not done yet." Then he turned and went back inside, ready to face whatever came next. The first light of morning spilled through the curtains as the man sat quietly at his small kitchen table. The notebook lay open before him, pages filled with neat handwriting and small sketches of maps and connections. Next to it sat a cup of cold coffee and a folded letter. The letter was from the reporter he had written to, the one who had replied saying, "I believe you." He had read it several times, trying to decide if he should trust someone again. Trust was a hard thing for him. He had seen too many promises broken in his life. But something about that message felt honest. The tone wasn't curious like a gossip writer. It was respectful, cautious, and careful. He picked up his phone, typed a short message, and hit send. "We can meet tomorrow, 9 a.m. at the park by the old bridge." Then he set the phone down, walked to the back door, and looked out at the yard. The grass had grown tall where Shadow used to lie. For a moment, he closed his eyes and whispered, "We're getting closer." The next day, the park was quiet. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the mist still hung low over the water. He sat on a wooden bench, his hands in his pockets, posture calm and steady. A few minutes later, a woman approached, not young, not old, carrying a camera bag and a notebook. She looked like someone who had seen her share of truth and lies and could tell the difference between them. She stopped a few feet away. "You're the one who wrote the letter?" He nodded slowly. "I am." She sat down across from him. "I've been doing this a long time," she said softly. "Most people who reach out to me are either lying or looking for attention. But your letter, it didn't sound like that. It sounded like someone who just wants to be heard." He looked at her for a moment, then down at his hands. I don't want attention. I want the truth to be seen. That's all, she nodded. Then let's start there. For the next hour, he told her everything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't exaggerate. He spoke simply, like someone giving a report. Every small detail of that night, the silence after, and everything he had discovered since. The woman listened carefully, taking notes but never interrupting. When he finished, she sat back, quiet for a long moment. Do you have proof? She asked gently. He reached into his bag and placed a small folder on the bench between them. Inside were printed copies of records, screenshots, and time-stamped photos. It's all there, he said. And more if you know where to look. She flipped through the pages slowly. You've done your homework, she murmured. He gave a small nod. Old habits. After a while, she closed the folder. I can't promise how this will go, she said. But if what you're showing me checks out, people will know the truth. That's all I want, he said simply. They agreed to stay in touch but not use names, not yet. He understood caution better than anyone. Over the next few weeks, the woman began digging through records on her own. She contacted departments, reviewed dispatch logs, and cross-checked camera times. Each time she found something that matched his notes, she sent a short message. You were right. Meanwhile, the man kept to his quiet routine. To his neighbors, nothing had changed. They saw him fixing his porch, tending his yard, or walking to the store. No one knew that every evening, behind closed doors, he was reviewing new information. He wasn't doing it out of anger anymore. It had become something bigger, a mission not just for himself, but for the truth that too often got lost in noise. Some nights he sat by the window, thinking about how strange it was that a single moment could change everything. He didn't blame the officers completely. He knew fear could make people act too fast, but he couldn't accept the way things had been covered up afterward. He wanted honesty, not punishment. Weeks passed, and the woman finally called him from an unknown number. Her voice was calm but carried a sense of urgency. I think it's time, she said. You were right about everything. I have the video, the reports, the witness statements, and all of it. He didn't say anything at first. His hands tightened slightly around the phone. When will you publish it? He asked. Soon. But I want to give you a chance to see it first. The next day, she sent him a link. It wasn't public yet. The title was simple, without drama. The Night the System Failed a Man and His Dog. He clicked play. The video was quiet, respectful. It told the story in plain words, and no shouting, no blame, just facts and images. It showed the police report next to the real-time footage. It showed the timeline he had written down almost perfectly matched the evidence. When it ended, he sat in silence. Then he whispered softly, Thank you. 2 days later, the story went live. At first, only a few people saw it. Then it spread. Local forums picked it up, then regional news outlets. People started sharing it, not because it was shocking, but because it was human. It showed a man who had done everything right, stayed calm, followed the rules, and still lost what he loved most. Within a week, there were questions being asked at town meetings. The police department released a brief statement saying they were reviewing procedures. The officers involved were placed on leave while an internal review began. The man didn't celebrate. He didn't smile or boast. He just watched quietly, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. He knew it wasn't over yet. Truth was only the first step. Change took time. Still, something inside him eased a little. He felt like the silence that had followed that terrible night was finally beginning to lift. One evening, he received another message from the reporter. People are reaching out. Some who were afraid to speak before are sharing their stories too. He read it twice, then typed back, That's good. Let them. The following week, the story reached national attention. Larger networks picked it up, discussing police training, fear, and community trust. They didn't use his name. They respected his wish for privacy. But the story carried weight. Neighbors who once only waved from a distance now stopped by his gate, not out of curiosity but respect. Some simply said, We saw the story. We're sorry for what happened. He always nodded, thanking them quietly. He wasn't bitter anymore. He had turned his pain into something useful, something that might help others. One morning, as he stood on the porch, he saw 2 children walking by. They stopped at his gate, holding a small drawing. We made this, one of them said shyly. He took it gently. It was a picture of a man and a dog under a tree. The dog had wings, and above them were the words, "Good dogs never really leave." He swallowed hard, smiled softly, and said, "That's beautiful. Thank you." He pinned the drawing on the wall beside his desk. Every time he looked at it, he felt peace, and not full healing, but a step closer. A few days later, the reporter called again. "You might want to watch the news," she said. He turned on the television. The department's chief was giving a public statement. They admitted there had been errors in judgment and promised new training procedures to prevent such incidents in the future. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something. He watched quietly, then turned off the TV. He didn't need grand speeches. The truth being acknowledged was enough. That night, he walked down to the field where he used to train Shadow. The grass was taller now, but the place still felt the same. Quiet, open, endless. He stood there for a long time, looking up at the stars. He remembered how Shadow used to run across that field, ears back, eyes full of life. He could almost hear the echo of paws hitting the ground, the sound of joy that only a loyal companion could bring. He smiled faintly. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. "The truth is out." The wind rustled through the trees as if answering him. From that day on, things began to shift. Not just in his town, but in nearby places too. More people started asking questions, demanding transparency. Some officers even came forward to support reforms. Quietly, change began to take root. The man didn't take credit for any of it. When people asked him for interviews, he declined politely. "It's not about me," he would say. "It's about what's right." He kept living simply, keeping his small routines. He repaired things for neighbors, read in the evenings, and sometimes volunteered at the local animal shelter. The workers there didn't know his story in detail, but they could sense kindness in him. Dogs always seemed to trust him right away. One of them, a young volunteer, once said, "You must have had a good dog before." He smiled, looking down at the small brown puppy sitting by his feet. "The best," he said softly. Weeks passed and seasons began to change. Leaves turned gold and red and the air grew cooler. The man often took long walks again, this time alone but at peace. He no longer avoided the route where everything had happened. Now it was just another street, a part of his story, not the end of it. One evening, as he returned home, he saw a note tucked under his door. It was from the reporter. "Just wanted to thank you again," it said. "Because of you, people are listening." He read it and smiled quietly. Then he placed it in his notebook on the last page beside the first words he had written months ago. "If the truth isn't told, it gets buried." He closed the notebook gently and set it back on the shelf. He didn't need to open it again. That night he sat on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars. For the first time in a long while, the silence around him didn't hurt. It felt peaceful again. He looked at the empty space beside him and whispered, "You'd like this, wouldn't you?" A soft breeze brushed past and he smiled, as if hearing an answer only he could understand. In the distance, the town was quiet. No flashing lights, no noise, just calm. The kind he had searched for all his life. He took a slow breath, closed his eyes, and let the stillness sink in. The world wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a long time it felt honest, and that, he thought, was enough. The winter air carried a quiet stillness that morning. The streets were soft with frost, and the first rays of sunlight made the world look almost untouched. Inside a small old house at the end of the lane, the man sat by the window, a blanket over his shoulders, a warm cup in his hands. It had been months since the story had broken and changed everything. His days had fallen back into a calm rhythm. He liked it that way. There were no more interviews, no more flashing lights outside his gate, no one trying to ask for quotes or reactions. Just peace. He had never wanted fame. He only wanted truth. And now that the truth had found its place in the world, he was content to fade quietly back into it. Still, every now and then, letters came. Handwritten notes, emails, sometimes even drawings from children. People he had never met before thanked him for standing up. Some shared stories of their own losses. He read them all. Sometimes he wrote back, but most of the time he simply kept them in a small wooden box beside his bed. It wasn't pride he felt when he looked at them. It was connection, the kind that comes from shared pain and quiet strength. One morning he went to the local shelter again. It had become a place where he found a kind of peace. The dogs always seemed to know who needed comfort most. They wagged their tails, nudged his hands, and followed him as he walked through the rows of kennels. There was one small dog he had grown fond of, a white and brown mix with soft eyes and a nervous tail. The staff told him she had been found wandering near a highway, scared and hungry. No one had claimed her. Each time he came, she ran to the front of the kennel, paws up, tail wagging. One day the volunteer smiled and said, "She seems to like you more than anyone else." He looked at the small dog for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe she knows what it's like to lose something." The volunteer tilted her head. "Are you thinking about taking her home?" He smiled a little. "Maybe, we'll see." That evening he walked home under the pale sky. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the clouds orange and pink. He paused at the small wooden cross he had placed in the backyard months ago, the one that marked Shadow's resting place. He knelt down, brushing the frost from the ground. "I think you'd like her," he said softly. "She's small, but she's got heart." He stood up and stayed there a while longer, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves. Then he turned and went inside. A few days later, he returned to the shelter and signed the papers. The small dog went home with him. At first she was nervous, shy around loud sounds, hesitant with new spaces. But he had patience. He never forced her to do anything. He just sat with her, talked softly, and let her come closer in her own time. It didn't take long before she began following him everywhere. When he sat on the porch, she curled beside his feet. When he worked in the shed, she lay by the doorway, head resting on her paws, eyes watching him calmly. He named her Hope. The name fit her perfectly. She wasn't a replacement for Shadow. Nothing ever could be. But she brought warmth back into his home. It was strange how something so small could carry so much healing. As weeks passed, he started writing again. Not reports this time, not records or timelines. Just thoughts, reflections, lessons. He filled page after page with simple words, not for the world, but for himself. He wrote about how loss changes people, how truth takes courage, and how forgiveness can be harder than anything else. Sometimes he stopped mid-sentence and stared out the window. The world outside seemed softer now, as if time itself had learned to be gentle again. One day he received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a short letter written in careful handwriting. "You don't know me, but your story changed how I see people. I'm studying to become a police officer. I want to be better, to listen more, to act with care. Thank you for reminding me that every life matters." He read it 3 times. Then he folded it neatly and placed it in the wooden box. That one meant more than all the rest. It meant something had truly changed, even if only for one person. Spring came early that year. The snow melted and the field near his home bloomed with small wildflowers. He often took Hope there to run. She wasn't as fast or strong as Shadow, but she had her own kind of joy. She'd chase butterflies, bark at the wind, and run back to him with her tail wagging wildly. He'd laugh quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep and real. Sometimes, when they walked by the river, people recognized him. They didn't stop him for pictures or stories. Most of them just nodded, their eyes saying more than words could. He appreciated that kind of respect, and silent, kind, human. The town itself had changed too. The police department had new faces, new policies, and community meetings every month. The chief invited local people to speak openly about safety and fairness. For the first time, there was real dialogue. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The man never went to those meetings. He didn't need to. The fact that they existed was enough for him. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch with Hope at his side, he heard footsteps on the gravel path. It was the reporter who had helped him. She smiled when she saw him. "I was passing through," she said. "Thought I'd check in." He motioned toward the empty chair beside him. "You're always welcome." She sat down, looking at the small dog curled near his feet. "New friend?" He nodded. "Yeah, she found me." The reporter smiled softly. "Seems like you both needed each other." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the gentle sounds of the wind and birds. Then she said quietly, "You know, your story did more than you think. It didn't just open eyes. It reminded people that real strength doesn't come from anger or revenge, and it comes from truth." He looked out toward the yard, thoughtful. "Truth is harder than people realize. It doesn't make you feel good. It just gives you peace," she nodded. "That's why it matters." When she left, he felt grateful. not just for her help, but for the way she had told his story without turning it into noise. She had treated it like something living, something that deserved care. As the days grew longer, life became quieter again. But it wasn't the lonely kind of quiet anymore. It was calm. Sometimes he'd see a news clip or article mentioning his case, calling it a turning point or an example of change. He never commented or replied. He didn't need recognition. The only thing that mattered was that the truth had found its place. He spent more time outside now, gardening, repairing fences, fixing old tools, things that made his hands busy and his mind clear. Hope followed him everywhere, her tail wagging constantly. At night, when the stars filled the sky, he'd sit on the porch with her beside him. Sometimes he'd speak softly to the air as if talking to shadow. "I think you'd like her," he'd say. "She's brave in her own way." The wind would stir gently, brushing through the trees, and he'd smile faintly. One day, as he walked through town, a man approached him, a local officer in uniform. The man stopped a few steps away, nervous but sincere. "Sir," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, thank you. I joined the force after everything happened here. We talk about your story and training now, not to blame anyone, but to remind us what it means to serve right." The older man studied his face, then nodded slowly. "Then make it count," the officer smiled slightly. "We're trying." As he walked away, the man felt something he hadn't in a long time. Pride, not in himself, but in what others were becoming. Years went by quietly. Seasons changed. The house grew older, and so did he. Hope stayed by his side through all of it. Gentle, loyal, constant. Sometimes visitors came, journalists, community leaders, young people working on documentaries. He always welcomed them kindly but spoke little. He believed the story was no longer his to tell. It belonged to everyone who learned from it. He often thought about legacy. Not fame, not remembrance, but the kind of legacy that lives quietly in people's hearts. He wanted his story to remind others that silence can be powerful, that dignity matters, and that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds light. On a soft summer evening, he sat under the same tree where Shadow used to rest. Hope lay beside him, head on his knee, her eyes half closed. The sunset painted the sky gold and pink. He looked out across the field and whispered, "We did what we could." There was no bitterness left in his voice, only peace. He thought about everything that had happened. The loss, the pain, the truth, and the slow healing that followed. It had been a hard road, but he had walked it with purpose. And as the first stars began to appear, he realized something simple yet powerful. Even the quietest acts of courage could change the world a little. He smiled to himself, feeling the soft breeze move through the grass. "Good job, old friend," he whispered to the memory of Shadow. Then he leaned back against the tree, eyes closing for a moment, listening to the world breathe around him, calm, alive, and honest. The sound of Hope's gentle breathing filled the air. In that stillness, everything felt complete. And though time would move on, and the world would keep spinning with new stories and new struggles, the truth he had fought for would stay, like a small, steady light that refused to go out, because sometimes one man's quiet fight for what's right becomes a voice for thousands who were too afraid to speak. And sometimes, the deepest kind of victory doesn't make noise, it simply brings peace. The days had grown slower now, the kind of slow that made time feel soft. The man had settled into a rhythm that suited him, simple mornings, quiet afternoons, and long walks in the evenings. Hope, his little dog, followed close beside him wherever he went. Her small paws made soft sounds on the dirt road, and her ears perked up every time a bird sang. He liked those walks. They reminded him that the world still had beauty in it, even after all the things it could take away. The sun still rose every morning. The wind still moved through the trees. Life somehow always found a way to keep going. Sometimes he would pass by the town park, the same one where he had once met the reporter. People there often recognized him, though they rarely said his name. They greeted him kindly with quiet respect. He never expected that from anyone, and it always humbled him. Children played on the swings while parents watched from benches. Young couples walked hand in hand. Older folks sat and fed the birds. It was ordinary, but that was what made it special. Ordinary was what he had fought to protect all his life. One afternoon, as he sat watching the sunset at the edge of the park, a young man approached him. He looked about 20, nervous but determined. "Sir," the young man said softly, "I don't mean to bother you. I just wanted to thank you." The man looked up, puzzled. "For what?" The young man sat down beside him, hands clasped together. "My father was an officer in this town. He used to be angry all the time. Always said people didn't understand what it was like. But after everything that happened, he changed. He started listening more. He said he wanted to serve, not control. I think your story had something to do with that." The man was quiet for a while. Then he said gently, "People can change, son. Sometimes they just need to see what truth looks like." The young man nodded. "He passed away last year. But before he did, he told me that what you did taught him more than any training ever could." The man felt his throat tighten a little. "He must have been a good man at heart." "He was," the young man said. "Thank you for helping him find it again." The two sat there for a few minutes longer, watching the sky shift from orange to pink to blue. When the young man stood to leave, he turned back once more. "You probably don't realize it," he said, "but you changed this town." The man smiled faintly. "The town changed itself. I just reminded it how." When he walked home that evening, Hope trotted happily beside him, tail wagging. He reached down and gave her a gentle pat. "People surprise you sometimes," he said quietly. The next few weeks were filled with small, peaceful moments. He fixed an old neighbor's fence. He helped a boy from down the road repair his bicycle. He even started visiting the community center once a week to talk with veterans who were having trouble adjusting to life outside the service. At first, they didn't talk much. They sat together sipping coffee in silence. But slowly words began to come, stories of sleepless nights, of memories that refused to fade, of guilt and loss. He never gave advice. He just listened. Sometimes that was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low, one of the younger veterans said quietly, "How did you find peace after everything?" The man took a long breath. "I didn't find it all at once," he said. "I stopped looking for it. I started doing small things that made sense. Fixing what I could, helping when I could, forgiving when I could. Somewhere in that, peace found me instead." The young man nodded slowly. "That sounds simple." "It is," the older man said, "but it isn't easy." When he left that night, he felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. Not because he had solved anyone's problems, but because he had reminded them, and himself, that healing was possible. Later that week, a letter arrived from the reporter again. She had moved to another city but kept in touch from time to time. The envelope held a single page and a small photograph. The letter read, "I wanted you to see this. A new training center just opened here, focused on empathy and community response. They said your story inspired the idea. It's called the Shadow Program, in honor of loyalty and service. Thought you'd like to know." He stared at the photo for a long time. It showed a small group of officers standing in front of a simple building with a sign that read, "Shadow Center." No bright lights, no celebration, just people standing together, ready to learn. He smiled softly. "You'd like that, old friend," he murmured. That night, he placed the photograph in a frame beside the small drawing the children had given him long ago, the one that said, "Good dogs never really leave. The seasons changed again." Spring turned to summer and the world bloomed. The man spent more time outside, planting flowers and trimming branches. Hope followed him everywhere, occasionally stopping to chase butterflies or dig small holes in the dirt. He talked to her constantly, about the weather, about the news, about memories. Sometimes it felt as if she really understood. One evening, as he watered the plants, he noticed a group of teenagers walking by. They were laughing, carrying cameras and notebooks. One of them stopped and asked politely, "Sir, are you the man from that story, the one they talked about in class?" He chuckled softly. "I suppose so. Why?" "We're doing a school project about honesty and courage," one girl said. "Our teacher said we should interview someone who actually made a difference." He smiled gently. "I don't know if I did all that, but you're welcome to sit for a bit." They sat on the porch steps, asking questions in that curious, genuine way only young people could. He answered simply, never trying to sound wise or heroic. He told them the truth. That courage wasn't loud, that it was often quiet, and that doing what's right sometimes meant standing alone. When they left, one of them turned back and said, Thank you. We'll remember this. He waved goodbye and watched them disappear down the road. For a long time he just sat there smiling. The world was changing. Slowly. But it was changing. As summer faded into fall, the air grew crisp again. The trees turned gold and red. The man began to feel the weight of years in his bones, but it didn't trouble him. He had made peace with time. Each morning he took Hope for a walk along the same path by the river. He liked the sound of the water, steady and calm. Sometimes he'd toss a stick for her, watching as she bounded after it with joy. One morning he met the local mail carrier, a cheerful woman who always had a smile for everyone. She stopped and said, "You know, every time I walk this road, I see you here. You and that little dog of yours look like something out of a storybook." He laughed softly. "I think we've both lived a few stories already." She grinned. "Well, you make this street feel safe. People notice that, you know." He nodded quietly. "That means more than you think." That evening, after dinner, he sat by the window, pen in hand. He began writing again, not for himself this time, but for whoever might come after. When they arrived at the town square, he saw dozens of people gathered, young and old, families, officers, teachers, students. There was no stage, no speeches, just quiet music, soft lights, and faces full of gratitude. Someone handed him a candle. He held it carefully as the flame flickered in the cold air. Around him, voices whispered prayers, stories, and promises to do better. He looked at the flame for a long time, then smiled. "This," he whispered, "this is what peace looks like." After the ceremony, people came to shake his hand, some simply placing their hand over their heart instead of speaking. He didn't need their words. He could see everything in their eyes. When he returned home, the night sky was full of stars. He stepped onto his porch and looked up. Hope curled beside his feet, tail wagging softly. "You see that?" he said quietly. "Light everywhere. Just like I told you. The truth always finds its way." He sat there for a long time, letting the quiet settle around him. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been. That was enough. As he watched the stars, he thought about everything he'd learned, that peace doesn't come from forgetting, but from understanding. That strength isn't measured by what you can fight, but by what you can forgive. And that love in all its quiet forms is what keeps the world from falling apart. The night breeze brushed past him, gentle and cool. He closed his eyes and smiled, whispering, "Thank you, old friend, for walking this road with me." Hope gave a small bark, as if answering, and in that moment, beneath the vast sky, with the world calm and still, he felt complete. The pain that once filled him had turned into purpose. The story that began with loss had become one of peace, and though time would one day move on, and new stories would be told, the light he had sparked, the truth he had carried, would remain, because real change doesn't fade. It echoes quietly in every heart it touches, and that, he thought, was the legacy worth leaving behind.